What's the good word, y'all? DKB here. So let's talk some money. New York Jets are heading into the off season. Unfortunately, a few times we just narrowly missed the playoffs, but it's full steam ahead. Things got to continue to move on, and I got a feeling we'll have another strong off season in regards to significant upgrades being made to this roster, specifically quarterback and offensive line. But of course, there's areas that we can improve throughout. So what I have for you guys is five candidates that I think could potentially be cut in terms of what will return us the most amount of cap space for us to try to make some of these significant moves that we think may come about. So this is pretty much essentially made strictly based off what's going to return us the most amount of money back. But a lot of these guys also are either underperforming, they're aging out, or the contract doesn't match up with the return on investment we're getting in terms of their performance on the field. So a couple things before we dive into that. There was some interesting stuff out there. Cap space wise, we're looking at about 8.2 million. And then when I looked at a lot of these contracts, the top 25 contracts, so largest value amounts, 40% of those belong to rookies, to let you know how expansive our youth movement over these last 2 years actually was. We're talking half half of our biggest contracts belong to rookies, and we're seeing a lot of the rookies, especially from these last two draft classes, absolutely crush it. So it's been amazing to see. Now let's go ahead and dive into it. Number one, shouldn't be a surprise, a lot of people have been asking for this for quite some time. CJ Mosley. So he signed a 5-year contract, 85 million. There was a we reworked his contract a little bit. We added some voided years and all of this nonsense, but there is a way we can potentially get out of this contract, which has looked horrendous. Essentially, since we signed it, pretty significant injury history that nobody could have really predicted or been prepared for, based on what we've seen before with them. And then when we have seen them, a pretty terrible season mixed in there, a couple amazing games sandwiched in there. And then, of course, in this full season, it's been a bit an up and down. But, I mean, for the record, he still was able to make these new Pro Bowl games. So it is what it is. But let's dive into it. So if we mark CJ Mosley as a post-June 1st release cut, there's going to be $17 million, which would be his value this year. $17 million in savings. However, we're going to get hit with the $4.4 million dead cap in 2023, and then in 2024, because it's going to get spread out over 2 years, we're going to get hit with the other 10.4 million. It's a lot. It's a hard pill to swallow. It's a lot of money to move into, 2 years from now, essentially. And we don't necessarily know what kind of position we're going to be in. But it would probably make the most sense. I mean, in general, the longer we hold on to CJ Mosley, the easier it's going to be and the less costly it's going to be for us. But if we absolutely feel like we just need to part ways, this will be the way that we can get it done. Now, for the record, again, he's making the Pro Bowl. That's not the end-all, be-all for me. I think a lot of what CJ Mosley's value is to this team is from a leadership, a program aspect. CJ Mosley was one of those guys that were already on the roster, but when you talk to Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich and all of these guys, the young players on the team, they all definitely look to CJ Mosley, especially when things are looking negative for the team. And so he brings that leadership ability. He brings the positive energy, the motivation. He's definitely trying to put his work out there on the field. I mean, he's top 10 in tackles in the league. But when I take a look at his body of work since we got him, he's only made 4 takeaways, couple interceptions, and then I think 2 interceptions, 2 forced fumbles, if I'm remembering correctly. So there just hasn't been an otherworldly impact that would justify a guy having this contract, even though the intangibles are off the charts, and what he's delivering to this team probably compensates for it. But you'd have to imagine you can find a younger guy that maybe can essentially kind of take on the production standpoint of leading by example and, leading the way for this team. Plus, with what we've seen recently, there's a few more pieces in place now that essentially can kind of walk the talk after the performances they've done. Sauce Gardner, Quentin Williams being the two that immediately jump to mind. DJ Reed is another. So depending on what we do with Quan Alexander, that would also be one immediately in the room. But let's keep it pushing. Second would be John Franklin Myers, our defensive end slash tackle. It's been very weird, but irregardless, 4-year, $55 million contract we gave out to him as a part of an extension based on what he showed us last year, and it was definitely great. Now, there's two options for us if we release him as a post-June 1st cut, much like we did with CJ Mosley in this example. We're only going to get hit with $400,000 in dead cap in 2023 and $800,000 in 2024. We're going to save ourselves $12 million. This looks like a no-brainer. On paper, I think it'll really come down to how much would Robert Saleh be willing to argue he needs to stay on the roster at his current value. You'd also have to question if Joe Douglas made a mistake dishing out this extension early. And now we're kind of backtracking it, although maybe it's better money used elsewhere, as we already mentioned. Now, the weird thing about John Franklin Myers is that, well, before we get into that, the second option, if we release him before June 1st, we'll save $11.2 million and we'll get hit with $1.2 million in dead cap in 2013. It's not a bad situation either way, but, being able to spread it out over the 2 years in the post-June 1st release makes the most sense. But as I was saying, so John Franklin Myers' situation is really weird. We've seen a breakout. There was a bunch of stats all over the place that mentioned when he was sat down as a defensive tackle, he had production on a per snap basis, essentially comparable to what Aaron Donald has been doing in some of his elite years. And the weird thing about John Franklin Myers is he's never really been able to eclipse over like 61% of the snaps on the season. It's part of a defensive line rotation as part of him finally having a breakout year last year. But we even seen a reduction of snaps this year, and that's just by nature. We've had better talent all else around. But he seems like he wasn't utilized how a lot of us was expecting. Defensive tackle was probably where I would have said we would have seen a 70-30 split, and it probably ended up being closer to 60-40 or 40-60, I should say, by the time the season ended. But he's seen a significant amount of time out on the edge, and that's by virtue of him being a pretty above average run stopper, being able to set the edge, and still being able to contribute in the sack department. But I really feel like we could have seen something transcendent with Quentin Williams and JFM out there. Granted, Sheldon Rankins was also having an exceptional year prior to the injury itself as well. But we'll have to see how this one plays itself out. I don't know if Joe Douglas would be willing to, perception-wise, make it seem like there might have been a mistake in dishing out that contract to him. It made sense at the time. All of the dots make sense. But again, we need to find a way to increase our cap space pretty significantly, especially with a lot of these quarterback trades that are being talked about. Lamar Jackson, chief among them. DeAndre Hopkins has been talked about as a weapon for this offense. And then, of course, on the offensive line, who knows who may be out there for us right now, but still. And then we also got to set aside money for the draft picks. It's going to be quite a bit. And as we've seen, we still are going to need to make sure we have some rollover money into the season in case we get hit with another rash of injuries. Third on the list, Carl Lawson, 3-year, $45 million contract. Everybody was extremely high on this guy coming in. I think ultimately, as we've seen, it really came down to Carl Lawson or Trey Hendrickson. And I think our focus shifted more to Carl Lawson than it did Hendrickson, although Hendrickson has been the better player currently. Granted, Carl Lawson lost a year, ACL injury. So when we dive into his numbers, we can release him basically at any time, trade him, etc. We're only going to lose $333,000 in dead cap space in 2023. We're going to save $15 million. Again, on paper, this looks like a no-brainer for us. And a lot of people are going to point to, unsatisfactory results or performance, I should say, either one, as a reason for why we should cut him. I would kind of toe the line a little bit in between yes and no. So ends the season with 7 sacks. I want to say it was 34 quarterback hits. It might have been 24, but he was definitely up there in pressures, although not like what we've seen from him in his Cincinnati days. Keep in mind, he was still coming back from an ACL injury, so we're talking about a pretty spectacular season. Enough, really, we brought him in to be a double-digit sack guy, ideally that forceful presence on the edge that can be combined with Quentin Williams and just cause chaos for offensive lines all day, 60 minutes long. Now, I would say that the results are satisfactory. It's probably not what we were expecting when we initially gave him out the contract, but we also don't have that second year worth of data to say, this is consistently who this guy is, a high pressure rate guy, low conversion in his sacks. But I feel like that's really what's going to be missing. Also, when you take him away, the only reason I can see Carl Lawson not continuing his season and at least seeing if he can live up to what we expected with another healthy offseason would be the fact that they really believe in Jermaine Johnson and they really believe in Michael Clemens. Two young guys, obviously much cheaper. We can save a lot of money. Production should be on par, if not better, or at least the combination of those two can make up for him as a whole. That's really the only picture that makes sense to me. Otherwise, we keep him on the roster. We see if we can, maximize what we were originally expecting from him. But it seems like a long shot. Carl Lawson just feels like one of those guys that's destined for us to move on. Maybe there's a way we can sweet talk him back into coming back on a cheaper deal, kind of a prove it situation. But we'll see if he's up for that. Otherwise, he's definitely earned himself enough leeway to get a decent contract from anybody else in the NFL at this point in time. My biggest gripe with him would really be that we never truly seen him take over and dominate a game. His preseason performances, which took him a while to warm up as well, never really translated into the regular season. He's popped here and there, but we really got periodic flashes. It wasn't even something that was consistent for weeks in and weeks out. It was truly periodic flashes of what he could be, what he might be on the cusp of achieving, much like we were expecting last year. So we'll see what happens there. Number 4, another guy that's been on, some of these lists for a minute, Corey Davis. We gave him 3 years, $37.5 million. We are essentially paying him about $12 million, give or take, a year, which didn't even put him anywhere close to the top 10 highest paid wide receivers essentially in the NFL. Definitely middle of the pack kind of contract. And we were hoping he was a strong number 2 that maybe can reach that, low tier, whatever, but number 1 wide receiver kind of status. And we would have bought low, essentially sold high with the contract that we dished out to him. It was the best of both worlds for both people. But with Corey Davis, we can release him at any time. We're only going to get hit for $666,000. We're going to save $10.5 million. You'd have to take a look at this roster and to say there's enough weapons that really you can sacrifice having a Corey Davis on the roster. And for a lot of people like me, the leadership component is great. However, the amount of drops in some of the situations and things that it came in along with his durability issues just kind of feels like he's walked himself out the door. I don't know. CJ Mosley and Corey Davis are in two completely different sides of the bucket for me when it comes to the intangibles. Corey Davis, yes, I think he's a great leader. I think he definitely contributes in a lot of ways throughout the roster as a whole, the run blocking. His ability to actually have clutch catches often enough, and then just what he brings from a size, athleticism component. But it's not the same levels what CJ Mosley offers, and the contract isn't anywhere nearly as crazy for us to get out of and probably match or get an upgrade via somebody else. It probably won't be around the same money, so I think that's what Mike LaFleur, Robert Saleh, Joe Douglas will really be kind of keying in on. Can they find somebody that's going to produce at the same level, do all of the same things to the ability that we've seen Corey Davis do it, and for somewhere around the same money, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But those are really the conversations. Otherwise, you make up for that immediately between Breece Hall coming back, maybe Michael Carter having a bounce back year. We've seen what Zonovan Bam Knight can do in the run game. But Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, you would expect to take a step depending on who we bring in the quarterback room and the consistency and stuff there. And then, of course, the tight ends, I would expect plays a little bit more of a consistent, bigger presence in the receiving game as well. So you're not really missing anything per se. You're not just going to, we might be missing a guy that kind of has the all-around ability to contribute to the offense. So again, we'll see. And then my final guy, Jordan Whitehead, 2-year, $14.5 million deal that we gave out to him. I pay attention to anything that's outside of these 3-year deals that Joe Douglas likes because he loves having that 2-year cushion. Can we see consistent, proven performance from this guy? If so, we'll extend him. If not, we move on. We don't really get wrecked beyond 2 years, if that's even a situation. Laken Tomlinson's contract is kind of a standout. But with Jordan Whitehead, we only got 2 years. And I feel like there was some concerns when we brought him in. Keep in mind, we were looking at Marcus Williams as a guy that we initially were targeting, and it was a high-value safety. So it was interesting because I didn't think we wanted to spend that kind of money at that position. But he priced himself out of what Joe Douglas was willing to offer. We were able to go to Plan B. Jordan Whitehead was the guy. Buy low, sell high. That was essentially the mentality with this. But it was really a 1-year prove-it deal effectively, or essentially anyways. Jordan Whitehead was coming off a Bucs roster, playoff experience, Super Bowl experience. He's been around some dogs. He's got to battle against Tom Brady quite a bit. The biggest knock on him was they never really asked him to cover, and so a lot of people had questions about his coverage ability. There was also, his missed tackle rate, I think, was a little bit higher than what the average was for his position. But what you've seen on film was a guy that you put him around the line of scrimmage, he's going to pop off every day. He almost had Troy Polamalu-esque instincts when he was near the box, near the line of scrimmage. He didn't necessarily get to really play that role often enough, in my opinion. And so maybe that's kind of taken away from what we really were going to get from him. But irregardless, what we expected for people that paid attention to the scouting reports and what they've seen on film is what we got. Coverage definitely isn't a strong suit of his, although he does have an ability to probably get better and more adept at it. But the tackles is what kind of kills it for me. He definitely went for a lot of big hits, way more often than needed. It left some pretty gaping holes at times where he essentially operated as a free safety, although that wasn't the intent when our run game was a little bit leaky. So with him, we can release him at any time. We are going to take one of the biggest hits this year outside of CJ Mosley's, which will be about $3 million. It's just a shade shy of that in dead cap space in 2023. But we would recoup about $7.25 million in cap savings. And so all of that, we mentioned we're looking at about $8.2 million right now in cap space. We would, with those 5 cuts, that would earn us about $60 million back. You can argue there's going to be some other guys as well and things like that that end up not being in the equation that we'll cut. And I want to say, I couldn't remember and I couldn't really find it by the time I wanted to work on this video, but I think the cap is supposed to increase, and I don't remember if the number was 20 million, which seems low to me, or if it was supposed to be 20%, whichever one makes more sense. But irregardless, I think we could be somewhere in about, I want to say 55 million on the low end and maybe about 72 on the high end, depending on what we end up doing in terms of cuts and all of that kind of stuff. But let me know what your guys' thoughts are. Would you cut off 5 of these guys? What combination of guys would you or would you not cut? And essentially why? And I'll catch you guys again. Peace.